Hello and welcome to another episode of A Pint of Politics and a Packet of Bacon Fries. You're joined today by myself, Evan O'Gorman, and my co-host, Jordan Freeney. Today we are going to be looking at the smear test scandal, which has really rocked the country by storm, possibly the biggest controversy that hit the HSE in history. We're going to be looking at the Northern Ireland Brexit crisis and how the border affects the Republic of Ireland. We're going to be looking at the 8th referendum as that takes place this coming Friday.
8th Amendment.
The 8th Amendment. The referendum.
There's been a few more than 8. 34,
yes.
I think.
Yes. Thank you for that correction.
No problem.
We're going to be looking at the 8th Amendment, which the referendum of which takes place this coming Friday. And we are going to be looking at how one Irish woman has become a very influential figure in global businesses. Jordan, it's been 5 weeks?
Yeah, it's been a long time.
Too long.
The last one. It's been doing well, actually. I saw our YouTube for the first one. I never put up the second one, got over 200 views, so that was good. And a lot of people have been asking me where it's been, which is always a good sign. I was so surprised. So many people that, like, it was the nicest feeling in the world when people that I haven't talked in like months or even years in some cases messaged me and asked me what's going on with the podcast. Part of it sort of was like, oh God, I've gotten so lazy, but it was so nice to see that people are actually listening to it, because I thought we were just talking to ourselves sometimes, to be honest with you.
Absolutely, and I think I've the same. A lot of people who I wouldn't really speak to that often have come to me and said it too. But what's really encouraging to see, though, which is kind of what we set out to do initially with this podcast, is that a lot of people who ask me where's it gone, what's happening with it, are people who I would have never considered interested in politics or current affairs. Never mind podcasts.
Yeah, but that's why we wanted to do it, wasn't it, originally, to encourage these kinds of conversations and have these talks with people that you wouldn't have ever thought you could be having these talks with. So it's great, and if you are listening to it and you hate everything we're talking about and haven't spoken to us since preschool, send us a message, because we really like it.
I suppose in its literal sense we're backed by popular demand.
Yeah, well, relatively popular demand.
No one's told us to stop doing it yet, so that's a good start.
Yeah.
Yeah, we've
touch wood.
Yeah, we've won up on George Hook there.
One thing I've realised I've learned a few things from just doing the 2 podcasts alone, but one thing I've realised is that my laughs are so irritatingly loud. I was testing, we got a new mic, everybody. You might notice the difference. Yeah, so I was testing out the new mic this morning, and when I was testing it, every time I laughed at my own jokes, that's how sad I am, they went off the scales. So I need to tone that down, because I am probably driving everybody crazy.
So I just have this vision of you now in my head, of you just sitting in your house by yourself with a microphone laughing hysterically.
Pretty much telling myself bad puns and then laughing at how funny I am, and then counting my friends on Facebook and realising I have 10 less than yesterday. And
so you'd recommend other people to go into accountancy?
Yeah, definitely. Solid choice.
One of the things, just before we jump into the topics of the day, one of the things that I approached you with once we decided we were going to get this back up and running again, it was on the back of a lot of feedback that a lot of people found that although they really enjoyed the podcast, they really enjoyed the content and our discussion of things, that we were sitting on the fence too much, and that almost was taking away from the engagement of the podcast.
Yeah, look, I think you have to take a side on some things. If you try to please all sides, then nobody really wants to say anything. So that's something that we're definitely going to look at going forward. That we're trying to go and make a more, while still being an educated approach, we're going to maybe portray our personal opinion a little bit more, in the hope that it will create more, reach our end goal, which is create more discussion around the areas. And regardless of whether you agree with us or disagree with us, I hope that everybody who's listening will be willing to at least discuss with us or discuss with anybody else the opinions that you hear on this. So
yeah, and I mean it's one thing for us to discuss our opinions than it is for us to try and convince you of something. So I'm certainly going to be a lot more open about my opinions on certain topics, but I'm not going to sit here for an hour or however long the podcast is and try to convince people that my opinion on a certain subject is the right opinion. And
because
as well,
mine is.
Exactly, yeah, yours is the right opinion, there's no questioning. And as well, as you said, I think it would be a great way for people to get involved by if you hear us say something that you don't agree with, tell us. Let us know. Let us know your opinion.
Yeah,
We'll
that's the
happily
one thing
discuss
I'm
it.
dying for. Is to somebody really just to turn around and being like, "Oh my god, shut up! You're three podcasts in and you haven't said one thing I agree with."
Absolutely. But
Like,
we were never going to get that. We were never going to get that if we were just sat on the fence.
yeah, exactly.
No one was ever going to challenge us because we weren't challenging anything.
Yeah, true. That's the age-old question, isn't it? Anyway, we better get right into
Better
it.
jump straight
and
in, yeah.
We got our laughs out anyway. My awkward laughs out anyway.
There's
at
not a
the
lot of
start
laughs in
because-
today's subjects, unfortunately. So
Yeah,
it's good to
they're
get
pretty
them.
dark,
Good
and
to get them in.
The first topic, I guess, is no exception, and that's regarding the whole smear testing scandal.
Yeah, it's as I said in the introduction. It's undoubtedly it's the worst thing that's ever happened to HSE. Never mind the people who've actually been affected by it directly. It's an unmitigated disaster, no matter how way you look at it. But start us off there. It gives a bit of background on what we're dealing with.
Yeah, so basically it came to light when a woman named Vicky Phelan won her case in the High Court, or brought her case to the High Court, and basically she was misdiagnosed. We're going to use misdiagnosed for now. I'll sort of clarify on that point later. She was misdiagnosed about her cervical check screening when she was given the all clear, and she shouldn't have been, and she later went on to develop terminally ill cancer. And obviously with such a serious disease, timing is everything in this, and there isn't any room for error. So she won her case anyway, and won quite a substantial amount, 2.5 million. Obviously nothing is a substitute for life, and no matter how much money she was given there, it was never going to keep her alive as such, and it's terribly sad in that sense. But what it did highlight, and what it could potentially do, is save a lot more people going forward. So basically, like, to go all the way back, or to explain roughly what smear testing is, because a lot of people I talk to don't even know fully what it is, and like, okay, I'm not going to go into, but basically they take a sample of cells, they test them to test if any abnormal this is in my very layman understanding
Yes.
of it as well, but just so we're all on the same page, they test these cells to check if there's any changes in abnormal cells, and if there are, they highlight that. And so it's a screening process, because if those cells have changed, there is a potential that cancer may be there or may develop in the future. And if there is no changes, then they can sort of say, right, you're fine for that for now. Come back another time and we'll check again. But what's happened is that back in 2007, 2008, the start of the recession, everything was about cutting costs. And so the tender came up for these checks, and it was leased out to two US firms. Originally one, Quest Diagnostics, and later MedLab Pathology or Clinical Pathology laboratories. But basically these are US firms that take the samples, they run the tests on it that they believe, run the tests that they were hired for, and then they send the results back to the Irish doctors. The issue arises because there is no universal agreement on what should be highlighted.
There's no regulation per se that's across the board.
So like, what one doctor in the States might highlight as this is an issue that should be tested as it could lead to cancer might not necessarily be picked up in here, or might be picked up over here that it is an issue when it wouldn't be in the States, and so on. And so what came back was that 208, there was an audit in 2014 of this whole system, and it came back that 208 of the screenings, or the samples, could have been diagnosed differently. So not that they were necessarily incorrect, but how they were treated were. So that while in the States it might have been perfectly fine for that, they might have said no, this is no issue because it'll be picked up somewhere else. When it was sent back to Ireland, they did not believe, or it could have been, they would have very much highlighted it, and it should have been communicated back to the patients. So that brings us up to pretty much where we are today, because since then it's come out that 18 deaths are linked directly to these missed diagnosis because of the difference of opinion as such.
So just to, I suppose, clarify that into one sentence. So just to pull up two words you use there. So the smear test isn't necessarily a diagnosis per se. So if someone gets a smear test, it's not saying whether they do or don't have cervical cancer.
Yeah.
It's giving them the possibility of contracting or developing cervical cancer in the future.
Yeah, now like it's a screening process, so they might have it already, and that would highlight it, but it isn't the diagnosis. Would like from the research that I conducted, it's very much a first step. So you go there, if you're given the all clear, you can sort of say, right, I'm okay for now, I'll come back another time and check if you're, but it should highlight any sort of tendencies towards cervical cancer and point you in the direction of the steps that you need to take.
And in that audit then, the 208, 209, I'm not sure what number it was, so that number of tests that came back said that the people whose test they were unlikely to develop cervical cancer. But after the audit, it's been found that those may not have been the correct. That might not be the correct
reporting of it. Yeah, and that's the big issue, that it's both tested differently in the States and reported differently. And it brings us back to this issue of cutting costs in the referendum. Or no, in the referendum, I'm jumping ahead here, in the recession. My mind is saying one thing and my eyes are reading something else, but yeah, so cutting costs in the recession, because this was like, everything was cost focused in the recession. Everything was driven by what can we do cheaper. And when it comes to something like this, when it's life and death, maybe this is something that we shouldn't have been looking completely at outsourcing. Like, I was looking at the tendering process at the time, and 400 of the 1,000 points were based on the price. Basically, whoever was cheapest would get the most out of those 400 points. An extra 50 was for value added services, so essentially another price indicator. So while it wasn't the majority of points were based off price alone, like, that's a huge number. You know, like, you're going to have a load of tenders coming in that will be very even across the other criteria, and then to give 400 points on price alone is huge. That will push anybody who is the most price competitive to the top of the poll. And so it ended up being that it was cheapest to outsource it to the US, which avoided a lot of the issues of doing so, in my opinion. I think that it's almost sloppy in a way. When you're outsourcing something, obviously there's the pros and cons of outsourcing, and one of them is that it's being cost effective. But surely one thing that you have to test, especially when you're doing a national cervical screening testing, right? So the first step for pretty much every woman in Ireland, and this is basically, like, you know, as the Minister for Health, or you know, as the decision makers, that this is going to be something that people base their whole life off. Like, it's not like the States where you might decide, oh, I'm going to go and check the whole process. This is a screening process that's supposed to allow women that comfort, or allow people that comfort, and of knowing whether there's a potential they have it or not. And to outsource it to a country where, or to outsource it to anybody who has a different testing and reporting method to your own, I just think that's sloppy, that you don't even, that to not even clarify, or to not have a review system in place, a review system that is relative to the matter that it involves. So for something like this, you need something that has quite a quick turnover of reviewing. So even if it's tested in the States, that it is reported on in an Irish standard, and that then it is returned back to the Irish side of it
being
quickly
HSE.
enough. Yeah, that they can review it in a quick enough manner that can be reported back to the patients. Surely that's something you need to have imposed in a system like this for it to be effective. And then not only that, but once these did happen, there were situations where there was arguments between the HSE, or the actual cervical screening committee, and the doctors and the gynecologist over who tells the patient. And these things all delay it, whether it be by days, months. This was a year in some cases. Like, how can you justify leaving a potential cancer victim, the difference between their life and death, on who wants to take responsibility for giving them the bad news? Somebody has to surely have a bit of integrity and say, look, nobody wants to hear this news, and nobody wants to be the person to deliver this news, but for the better of everybody, I need to deliver this. It really is outrageous, and that is like it's so infuriating, especially if you know somebody that has been involved in this, or if you are a victim of this. Like, it's so hard. There's no justifying it.
Yeah, and in terms of the victims you mentioned there, so I think this week or the weekend, the number has risen to 18 deaths, I think,
Yeah.
resulting from it, which, you know, if each of those is a case where what you just brought us through happened, you know, it's a depressing statistic. So I suppose the question now is, you know, it's very well to go back and criticize a government and policymakers in 2007, but you know that won't change the lives of the people who are affected. So I suppose the question now is what happens next. And we've seen obviously, you know, phenomenal backlash in the news from this happening over the last month. Government dissatisfaction is on the rise, on a sharp rise. I don't actually have the numbers right in front of me here, but
52%.
52% dissatisfaction. So, you know, that's obviously not great. And the government were, as we spoke in our first episode of this 6 weeks ago, the government weren't in a very stable position at the time then. I remember we had Fianna Fáil gearing up hard hitters to the front of their bench, presumably gearing up for a general election. So a general election has always been something that's been on the cards. So it'll be interesting to see how this affects the government's standing amongst the public. Simon Harris has said he wants to move the tests to Ireland. Is that something that you think is possible, putting what's happened aside, and if you look at it from a purely financial point of view, which ultimately the decision makers will be looking at it from?
Yeah,
is
like,
that something that can be done?
Like, the big question now is budget. Like, we've recently been speaking to the IMF and things like that, and there's this whole idea of, do we just balance our budget or do we create a surplus? And our fiscal space, which is the key word, and every other monetary organisation says don't use your fiscal space, and we say, well, that's what we're allowed to use as such. We do have a little bit of it left. There's theories that it's going to be used for tax cuts just before the election, but at end of the day it comes down to policy, the government policy, Fine Gael's policy towards it. I think because it is such a big issue, they're going to find the money somewhere. Whether that be cut it from somewhere else or use some of the fiscal space and maybe not use as much, not rely on tax cuts as much coming into the election to encourage their voter satisfaction. But I think the thing that we have to remember is that it is a fantastic idea. It is something that we have to keep going, and that nobody should turn around and just say it should be scrapped because it didn't work. Like, there's something crazy like 30,000 people screened on this a year, which is fantastic, and it's something that is really beneficial when it works. It's just about, we cannot let it slip and we can't take it for granted, and that is why we have to stay on top of it, and why more frequent audits should occur, or maybe more thorough audits. But yeah, to go back to your initial question, I do think that if there isn't the money there, that it will be found, or that I think the money is there, to be honest with you. Like, when governments want to, they can make the money appear to be very naive about it, but at the same time real about it.
Something this catastrophic as well is something.
But something like this, it needs to be monitored close by. It needs to have a quick turnover. Even something as simple, like when you take basic things, I know we live in such a modern world where we can get things, you can buy something from Amazon in China and you can have it at your doorstep the next day, but you know, maybe that's a day we don't have. Like, when you can drive a sample an hour up the road, it makes a hell of a difference. Mm-hmm. It's the difference between being tested on a Friday and being tested on a Monday. And while that might not seem like loads, then the testing might take a week or so. Like, this is all hypothetical, but time is such a valuable resource in something like this, and every minute, in my opinion, counts. So I think it's something that both should be and can be moved to Ireland.
There's an argument, so obviously the backlash of this, Tony O'Brien, he's the CEO of the HSE, and he was due to resign or due to retire from the HSE in late July, but obviously as a result of the smear test scandal, he made a quick resignation, shall we say. There wasn't any hanging around. Is it possible that now, look, Tony O'Brien, he's never been particularly popular in the public eye. He's always had quite a lot of criticism from groups across the board, HSE and non-HSE. Is it possible that he took the silver bullet, and that, so the government looked at the situation, people were demanding for something to be done, and something to be done is a fairly vague demand, but they have to be seen, the government have to be seen to be doing something, and they have to be seen to be doing something quickly. With his resignation coming in a couple of months' time and his unpopularity in the public domain, do you think firing him was an easy cop-out almost for the government?
Yeah, like, look, they're going to try and look at every sort of finger they can point, in a way. Anything that isn't pointing at them.
I'll just clarify, sorry, he wasn't officially fired, he officially resigned, but
Yeah.
you can...
Well, this is the way it works, especially with a public service, is that once the government doesn't show their confidence in you, is the sort of general term relayed, that once they lack confidence in you, you resign very quickly after generally implied. Now, look, you could be extremely naive again and just assume that all these things happen as a coincidence, and maybe they did, but like, if you're sitting in a position of power, you want to point every finger away from you, you want to say, look, we're doing this. Like, you can look at even the labs involved in this. Like, if you Google them, there's maybe 5% of the amount of articles on them as there is on the government involved in this. Even though the government would be at a very high level, they wouldn't be directly dealing with all these cases individually. You would think that the blame would be with the lab or something like that, but they take a step back and they point a finger at somebody else, and so you go in this circle of a blame game, and there's going to be a few people who are taken down along the way.
And that kind of goes back to what really caused a lot of the stress for so many people involved, was that nobody wanted to be to blame. They just wanted to push the responsibility on somebody else, to further the responsibility on somebody else. Yeah, so it's it'll be interesting to see what happens. As you said, more than likely they, hopefully anyway, will relocate their tests to an Irish facility.
Yeah, like, I just can't see any feasible reason now, when there's money available, the economy is doing better, that it shouldn't be here. Like, not in a protectionist kind of way. I don't care about taking jobs back or anything like that. It's just merely in a practical sense. And like, if you have experience with this and you feel that like it's perfectly fine for it to be in the States and that it's just it would make very little difference, let me know. But I really don't feel like that's the case.
Yeah, it'll be. I personally think the government, particularly Simon Harris. Look, I know Simon Harris. You're going back to 2007 here, when this was originally exported to America, and it's very hard to put. You can say he's responsible as the head of Department of Health, Minister of Health, but I think the government, especially him, they got off pretty lightly, I think. Yeah. No, I'm not suggesting that they should be punished or they should have some sort of. They should immediately all resign, but I thought the backlash on them would have been a lot more severe than it has been.
Yeah, this is...
Which is why I think the Tony O'Brien, it goes back to the Tony O'Brien thing, why I think maybe he was an easy kill almost. If the government and the Minister of Health is seen to be acting and, banishing the bad guy from the situation, then they suddenly almost become the good guys. And I'm not saying they are or they aren't, but I'm just suggesting that maybe that's...
why they've haven't been damaged as severely as you would expect. Well, yeah, this is an issue. Like, I think it brings to light a few different ideas around politics and what actually affects approval ratings. It kind of reminds me of a conversation we were having just before we started, where we were talking about Obama and how he'll be seen as if he'll be a good president or a bad president. And you made the statement that a president can be seen as successful if he leaves the country in a better state than when he started. And I think it very much depends on how you react to things, how you react to circumstances, because it might not necessarily, something completely out of your hands in a different government's time might come to light now that maybe had nothing to do with you, but your approval is affected by how you react to it. And that's what I think is happening here. I think, oddly enough, people are happy with how the government are reacting to it. And while there is very much a point the finger, they have opened up an inquiry and there's talks about bringing it back to Ireland, and maybe that's what the people are seeing, and they've sort of accepted that this is something that they can't change now and fix now, but it's all about reaction, and maybe that's partly why they have been not severely hurt on the polls over this, or as much as you'd expect over a scandal such as this.
Well, I mean, hopefully it's resolved in the best interest of those involved, and we'll see our thoughts go out to them.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, we'll leave that where it is at the moment. There's not really much more can be discussed by ourselves on that, and we are almost halfway through our originally desired time for this comeback podcast. So,
Ooh, a double series.
I tell you, we'll press on. So, there's been a bit of movement up in Northern Ireland. Not anything sudden, but it's been a sort of a slow brew in regards to Brexit, United Ireland, borders. Do you want to bring us through a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there's so much talk about this, and as it gets closer and closer to the time, it's obviously going to become a bigger and bigger issue. There's just so many things that are being thrown out at the moment, and the latest one is now that it's getting closer and maybe things haven't been resolved as quickly as the public would have expected, that there's fears of violence in Northern Ireland again. And I think I'm going to go right out and say I think they're well-founded fears, in the sense that you would be extremely careless to not consider the fact, or not to consider Northern Ireland's history when coming out to this, and being afraid of something like that happening again. That's something I remember we had when we were in school. We had I can't remember his name, the Auschwitz prisoner, come in to talk to us, survivor, to talk to us about his time in the concentration camp. And one of the things he said to me that really stuck with me was that we're the last generation to hear about these atrocities firsthand, and that it's so important to remember these things so that we never fall into this same trap. And it's something that the likes of Tony Blair has said as well about Northern Ireland, that we can't simply forget the past, that we have to remember that, and we have to remember the potential threat of violence when making any decision, especially something like a soft or hard Brexit. So the whole issue is whether a border would bring about violence, and many people think it will. We were talking about some polls at the start where we saw that 9% of the people surveyed would vandalise cameras on the border if there was. Now, at the same time, 0% said that they wouldn't harm another person, but who's going to get up in a survey and say that they're going to harm another person? One reassuring thing from that was to see that 60 to 80% of those surveys said that they would peacefully protest. So regardless of whether people are happy with the border or not, at least we can sort of be happy that the vast majority of people would see peaceful means of portraying their argument. Now,
but is that, sorry to cut across you, is that not, surely that it just really cements how bad the decision would be to bring in the border? Like, if we're looking at best case scenario, 60 to 80% of people peacefully protesting, like, what kind of decision is made where people are saying that they're going to be ready? They're prematurely saying they're going to be protesting by this decision made. Surely if 68% of people, that can't be a good decision in the first place.
Well, that's a whole policy issue with the Brexit. 56% of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain in the EU, and that's only since increased. I think the latest figures were 69% of the UK, not just Northern Ireland, wished to remain in the EU. So working on those statistics alone, that would imply that the same amount of people would be ready to protest against it, or would be in opposition of the idea. And that's an ongoing trend through Brexit, and maybe it's sort of, now that the honeymoon period of Brexit is over, people start to have to nail down and make the big calls and take the consequences before they may, it's so hard to judge what's going to happen out of Brexit, but whether it be good or bad, there's definitely going to be some consequences before they get either.
And can you tell people why the Good Friday Agreement is at jeopardy here?
Well, the whole idea of the Good Friday Agreement, and not one of the major reasons the Good Friday Agreement worked was because of the particular circumstances. So it created a very fine balance, I think. You had two countries that were now willing to work together, that weren't working in opposition. You had two countries that were members of the EU. And when you think about why the whole Good Friday Agreement was to solve the issue that the Republicans believed that they had a constitutional right and that they had a right to take Northern Ireland back, in a sense, by any means necessary, and loyalists would retaliate and believe that Northern Ireland had a right to be part of the UK. And so, like, that's a very, very simplified version. But the fact that all these situations emerged, the likes of the two countries being members of the EU and such, and had become more dependent on each other throughout the years, like, you have to ask yourself, what does a border do? And generally it stops the movement of people and movement of goods. And the fact that goods wouldn't need to be checked because of custom unions, and people wouldn't necessarily need to be checked because the EU could come to some, or the two countries at least, could come to some sort of migration unanimous decision. It allowed an invisible border to be created, is what they call it. And because then you could essentially stand on the border, there was no separation as such, bar the better roads maybe, between Northern Ireland and Ireland. You could stand on the border and you wouldn't even know. And once you start putting up walls or start putting up visible barrier, now by visible I don't mean just being able to see it, I mean, like, even if you see armed guards at the border, or whether you see that you have to slow down and go through a toll as such coming in, that starts to create, well, hold on a second, where are we going here? Because the whole idea of this was that it was sort of left in neutral grounds, that it could go either way. It could go Irish or towards the UK. But lately, with the likes of the DUP being in the British government, the whole Northern Irish Parliament dissolving in January 2017, and now budgetary matters are decided by Britain, it almost seems, or it could be perceived, that Northern Ireland is being pushed back towards not British rule, but it's being, I know this is such a sensitive subject, but I'm just trying to say that it can be perceived that this whole harmony has been disrupted. The ecosystem or the geopolitical system of Northern Ireland is changing. That you no longer can simply move from Republic to Northern Ireland if there's a border in there, and so then you might say, well, hold on a second, how come you can move from England to Northern Ireland basically freely if this is supposed to be a medium state as such, if that makes sense? To try and give an idea of the balance, the very brittle balance that's been achieved, like the MI5 intelligence service in the UK have consistently ranked Northern Ireland before ISIS or before anything else like this came along as severe, which is what everywhere else in Europe is at now. So they always saw that there was a very fine line being drawn here, and anything can upset this balance. They've also, in the British Parliament, in their UK in a Changing Europe recent report, basically just stated that while there's a belief in human harmony and that people will work together, that any situation in Northern Ireland could deteriorate very, very quickly. And so there's definitely a threat of violence there, especially because of this whole disruption to the geopolitical system. But I think that we have to have faith in the growing emergence of globalization, that because of that, the 20, or my maths is completely off now, the 20-year period since the Good Friday Agreement, people have integrated enough that we no longer look at each other as you and me, but as us. And so hopefully that no longer just stops us at a border, and hopefully that's not what this border will do. And that's why I think everybody is looking for a soft border, because the softer the border, the lower the wall you have to look over, essentially, to see your neighbour. I feel like once you can do that, there's less threat of violence.
It kind of highlights the whole issue of Northern Ireland. Now, I don't want to get into Northern Irish history and politics here, because we'll be here for 5 days recording if we do. But there's something, for me, strikes me as there being something fundamentally wrong with a country that, yes, is in a state of harmony right now, based on an agreement that was made 20 years ago and has remained in a relatively harmonic state since. But by the introduction of a border between it and another country can cause that harmony to descend into an oblivion of chaos. For me, it kind of highlights that although what we have right now is as good as we're probably going to get, it's really not great that we have to rely on the fact that there can be no change to this harmonic rhythm without the possibility of utter chaos and violence in what's comparatively a tiny country of a very small population.
Well, this is something that only peace can change, right? So the longer you live in harmony, and I was watching some great time lapses. I think it was on the Irish Times, where they basically showed the dispersion between Catholics and Protestants in cities like Derry and Belfast, and you can draw a line down it and see one side lives on one side and the other lives on the other, and then along comes the Good Friday Agreement and they start to integrate. And now you can still clearly see that divide, but there's integration happening. And the longer you have peace and the longer you keep things in that harmony, people will start to integrate. And you got to think, it's almost the opposite of how we got here in the first place. So the plantation separated people, and that's how the situation emerged. But by keeping them together, then it will eventually improve. And while 1 minute I'm saying we have to remember history, that in 100 years, when you're living beside your neighbour and they're a Protestant and you're a Catholic, you might not necessarily, you'll be naive to the fact of the issues that you two would have had based on your religion in a previous century. And so in those situations, in a different time, in a different century or a different generation, if a wall was put up, it might not have had such an issue. But it's because I think it's so, like 20 years is fresh, you know, it's like if this was a bandage in the world, you literally just put it on and took it off. So
we're close to 20. I like to still believe that I'm still close to 20 anyway. So
yeah.
if we look at our time on this planet in comparison to the greater time of the Earth and great time for recorded history, I mean, it's minuscule. It's so small. So yeah, it's a good point that it is such a small amount of time, and wounds probably are still fresh under those bandages. It's good that just before I move on, so I suppose the Irish government do have the support of the EU, the open support of the EU. That I think the EU said something along the lines that an agreement won't be made until the Irish government are happy. So I mean that's good in the sense that the Irish government, we know what their stance is, that they want a soft border. So
yeah,
there's promise there.
And that's one thing I see that I was reading a lot of pro-Brexit articles because, again, I tried to get a perspective from both sides, and they're so infuriated by Varadkar and Coveney, and whether you like them or not, at least by playing hardball, they're really forcing this whole we're taking nothing but a soft border, if not a soft Brexit, because I feel like soft Brexit is almost guaranteed if there's a soft border or if there's no border at all.
There was a cartoon someone put out, I can't remember who it was, on Twitter. I think it might have been somebody in the DUP, but I could be wrong, so correct me if I am. And it was so incredibly offensive. Now, I found it very funny because I have a very dark, twisted sense of humour, but it was so offensive. And, you know, it was like, there was a cartoon, it was like somebody holding this child's hand, and the adult holding the child's hand had a British Union Jack kind of clothing. And the child, you know, it was like it was messy. It was covered in dirt. It was kind of drooling at the mouth, and it had an Irish flag as the T-shirt, and it said on the cap, "Please be patient. I have famine," or something like that. Jeez. It was so incredibly offensive.
That would have been perfect for Bizarre Stories this week.
Yeah, it would have actually. It would have. But
well.
It was brilliant. It got completely obliterated off the internet. It's still on a Reddit forum. You can find it if you want. I'm not going to attach it with the podcast because the podcast will just get taken down then. But I definitely implore you to check that out. It's very funny. Anyway, shall we move on?
Yeah, we have a lot coming up on the one particular day.
It's a big day.
It is.
This coming Friday.
This Friday, the 25th. Of May. So, before we move on to what is probably going to be the biggest and most controversial section of our podcast, and probably of this whole series that I feel like we'll never get away from it, let's talk about something a little bit lighthearted. Your Woman of the Year, or a woman you are very fond of? When I say fond of, but you're very happy for anyway.
Yeah.
You were talking quite well of her
You're kind of making me sound like I kind of have feelings for this.
I don't know, maybe you do. Like, you were very insistent on having this section in.
Yeah, so
We'll edit that
wow, you really threw me under the bus with that one.
out.
So there is, if anyone isn't aware of the GDPR, so you might have heard of the GDPR in the news, stands for the General Data Protection Regulation. You might be subtly aware of it because you've been bombarded with emails in the last 3 to 4 weeks of any website you've ever signed up an account on, whether it's for shopping, whether it's for, getting your nails done, whether it's for booking your five-a-side pitch. You're probably been getting bombarded with emails about how that company handles your data, or we have a new privacy policy, can you read this please? You go onto a new website and they tell you, please read this privacy policy. You used to get it a lot, but you're starting to get it a lot the last couple of weeks, and that's because Europe has brought in these new laws around how businesses and organisations store, manage and share your online data. There's a particularly interesting character in all this, and that is the character of Helen Dixon. Now, Helen Dixon is the Irish Data Commissioner, and she has been... Now, Ireland is a small country with a small population. If I went to somebody in, Italy and told them about Helen Dixon, the Irish Data Commissioner, it would be completely irrelevant to them. Why would anyone care about who the Irish Data Commissioner is? So she's been getting quite a lot of attention, a phenomenal amount of attention, particularly in America and Canada, from some of their big publications over there, New York Times, Seattle Times, Toronto Star, and obviously our side of the sea, the Financial Times as well. All very interested in this woman. Reason being is because if you look at all the big data junkies in the world, you've got Facebook, you've got Google, you've got Apple. All of their European and a lot of their Middle Eastern homes are based in Ireland. Now, because they're based in Ireland, Helen Dixon she's on their doorstep. She has easy access to them, as to the whole data commission. So if they're going to be the ones who are enforcing the GDPR on these companies, the rest of Europe's data commissioners are going to be looking at Helen Dixon to enforce that, because we're on the ground with these companies in our small little potato farming island off on the west coast. Basically what it means is, if, for example, so this Friday, why this Friday is so important is because that's when these new regulations come into play. And, if you haven't been living under a rock the last 3 or 4 months, there was a lot of controversy over data protection there, regarding particularly Facebook, Cambridge Analytica, their influence, Russia as well, their influence on Brexit and the Trump campaigns. Mark Zuckerberg had to appear before Congress over.
Yeah, so this was what I was just about to ask you. Is this kind of Europe's... It's almost like she's the good guy and Mark Zuckerberg's the bad guy, kind of like...
It really is, and it's funny, America, the rest of the world bar Europe have been really slow to move on this. Particularly America have been very, very slow to move on this, and it contributes to the whole skepticism of Silicon Valley. There's a growing movement of people that want nothing to do with this Silicon Valley movement, this tech movement. They don't understand it, they don't trust it. It's understandable in some cases. But the fines for this, Helen can put some serious fines in place for some of these companies. So if you take Facebook, for example, if Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook fail to meet the GDPR standards, I don't have those standards in front of me. I did have them, but they would make you very, very sad after listening for 4 hours on all of them. If they fail to do it, they can be fined up to 4% of their global revenue, not just their Irish, not just their European, but their global revenue. So in Facebook's case, if that were to happen, if they were to be hit with a maximum fine, that'd be 1.6 billion US dollars in a fine.
It's a hefty enough, isn't it?
Yeah. So look, it's not a crazy big story. I suppose the bigger story of it is the GDPR regulation. But I just thought it was great that someone in Ireland was getting such recognition globally.
Yeah, good job, Helen.
Good job, Helen. Well done.
This is something that really shocked me when I heard about it first. I loved watching. Did you watch the Mark Zuckerberg the interrogation by Congress? It was painful from both sides.
It was really funny to watch. Yeah. For all the wrong reasons. It was so funny.
It really was, over such a serious issue, and I don't think anybody could almost take it seriously, but there's things came up on it that were so shocking. So the likes that Facebook collected profiles on people that weren't associated with Facebook. Now look, I've always been one, when the whole NSA came out in America and all this, and that we're all being monitored and everything. And I kind of was one of these people that for a long time thought, you know what, I'm not interesting enough for me to care about being monitored. I'm not like doing anything important. Like, if you want to look at me through my webcam while I'm playing GeoGuessr, trying to find out where I am in the world, like, by all means work away. But I always thought it was something that wasn't really that bad, because look, I'd kind of know that if I'm opening a laptop I'm going to be spied on, like if I put my tinfoil cap on now, or that if I use Facebook they're going to collect my data. But the fact that they were taking data from people that weren't even members of it, like, I hate Facebook. I despise them, but it's so addictive. And like, ironically, I'm going to post this podcast all over Facebook later.
Absolutely.
So give us a like.
Give us a share. Very important to give us a share.
Yeah, exactly.
Fill out the survey, your age, your gender, what your favourite, what your demographic is, all that sort of thing. We won't sell it to Facebook, don't worry.
No, definitely not. But like, it just really, it was actually the first time that it got to me. I couldn't get over how little the Americans wanted to regulate on, and a lot of it, as you say, seems to be because Silicon Valley, have such a political force and such money behind them that I think anybody's going to be unwilling to take them down. And you saw how friendly a lot of the senators and the Congress people that actually knew what the internet was were with Mark Zuckerberg, and how they thought he was more of a hero. Like, it seemed like they were interviewing for 90% of the Congress people.
I feel like they were interviewing him on Saturday Night Live or
something. That he was here, and it was like, Mark, what have you done with my data, Mark? And then you'd get a laugh out of the audience, and then they'd switch to some game show or something. Like, it really seemed like that. So, like, really props to somebody like Helen, who is really pushing this and putting Ireland at the forefront of, as a country, of somebody that want to be proactive about something that is going to not necessarily need regulation but need monitoring. While maybe we don't necessarily want the internet regulated, I think it's an okay thing to ask that my data isn't shared with a website that I'm not on, and that it's not sold and made money for. Just feel like
it's a small ask.
Yeah.
It's a small ask.
If I knew I could sell my data, and like, if I'm not on Facebook, let me sell my own data. Don't go and take my data and sell it to somebody else. Sorry, I've completely taken off your point, but
I won't judge you. Anyway, let's move on. I wish Helen obviously the best of luck in
keep doing.
Hopefully she gets a few big fines as well. It'd be kind of just for the. I've nothing against big global companies or anything like that. I think it's great having them in Ireland, but I always love a bit of controversy. And if Helen turned around and said, "All right, we're going to be taking 1.6 billion quid off Facebook," that'd be pretty exciting.
Go down to the Keys and knock on Google's door, and
we're
going to get banned from all these websites now. We won't be able to post anything on SoundCloud. We won't be able to share anything on Facebook.
Oh well.
Follow us on
the deep web, which will be the only podcast on the deep web.
That's our niche.
That is our niche, actually. Yeah.
How did we miss that?
And we could sit here. We could just slate Facebook and then shill loads of weapons and drugs on the show.
That's.
Oh my god, we could monetize the show with weapons and drugs.
There we go. Anyway,
let's move on to more pressing and more serious matters that don't involve the shilling of weapons.
Yeah.
There's another big thing happening this Friday in Ireland, particularly, and that is, I'm going to say it right this time. I'm not going to say the 8th referendum.
Here we go.
I'm going to say...
That's going to kill the mic.
The 8th Amendment.
Referendum.
I was leaving a pause, George.
No problem. I just got to admit, it's a habit now. Every time you say it, I have to jump in with something.
So look, I'll kick us off. I'm just going to make a quick reference back to our first show of this, which we touched on the subject on at the time as well.
Yeah.
6 weeks ago. I'm just going to compare the polls real quick and just going to give my... Not much has changed, I suppose, apart from the polls. Not much has changed in the referendum. It's not like a general election where you have people dropping out here and there.
Yeah, I had in the first one I ranted a lot about how the courts had decided everything and legislation as such, the main thing that's changed since we last talked was the polls, really. So
there hasn't really been much change. So just to kind of visit those. So back in January, which were the most recent polls when we last did our show, the yes vote was at 56% and the no was at 29%, which I argued at the time, that was only Yeah, that's a 27% difference in those two votes, not including the 15% swing. So I was arguing at the time that that's still pretty up in the air 6 months before a referendum. I didn't think they were going to change as much as they have done, and particularly in my opinion, that's quite a lot. So it stands now, yes, are at 44%, so they've gone below 50, which for any election campaign is never great, especially when there's only two outcomes. And no has gone up to 32 with a 12% swing. So obviously you can see there that no have either taken up a large quantity of the yes voters and a small portion of the swing, vice versa. It's hard to say, but they're getting close.
Yeah, so you made a good point earlier. You were saying that the no side. It's funny because I'm a yes voter. You're a yes voter, if you don't mind me saying
Yeah,
it.
no,
But
absolutely.
I think it's important to constantly keep watch of what the other side is doing. And one thing you said to me earlier that really stuck out was that these polls favour no. So why do you think that?
Yeah, and it's a theory that I have myself, just based on recent similar elections, both in, well, not in Ireland necessarily, but in well, a little bit in Ireland actually. The marriage referendum sort of plays into the theory, and I'm happy to discuss this with anybody. But although the no are down, I think judging by recent large scale elections where you have a conservative versus a liberal opposition. So you take this, for example, you take the marriage equality, you take Brexit, you take the American presidential election. They were all conservative versus liberal oppositions. So let's just say, for example, we take these polls as true, and the polls are very accurate and very reliable. So if the polls are true, then the no will be pretty confident over the last, especially with these most recent polls, which I think only came out this month, of their rise. Well, not so much that they've risen significantly, but no, but yes, have dropped significantly as well. So the no side are going to be pretty confident that they can really put a big push in this week to try and get those remaining 12% swing. Now, let's say, for example, we take the polls as unpredictable, which, if you look at those recent elections that I just mentioned, the polls in all of those bar marriage equality, so if Brexit and the American presidential election, the polls for both of them favoured the Liberal vote consistently until election day, when the Conservative vote won. Now, if I'm a no voter and I'm aware of this and I'm looking at those current polls where yes has remained consistently ahead by still more than 10%, sometimes 20%, I'm not really going to be too concerned about that, because the way I see it, well, conservatism versus liberalism has shown in recent elections that the polls just aren't reliable. So that's why I think, as a no voter, if I was a no voter and I was looking at that, I'd be pretty comfortable going into this election, despite the yes having a lead consistently. Now, I know you have a different view on the polls.
Don't agree with you. I'm sorry.
Why? Tell me why.
And every time I hear it, like, you make a better argument each, like, I think we talked about it twice before the show, and every time you've argued it, you actually argue it better, and I'm starting to more see where you're coming from. The only thing that I think will happen in this, that the only factor that it will be different in this, is the fact that, as you said, it's the Liberals that are usually the favourite to win. And I think it's because of them being so outspoken. And I think in those other votes, there was maybe a secret voter. You know, you didn't say what you wanted out loud, not even to polls, because it was almost frowned upon. You got a phone call to say who you're voting for as part of a survey, and you didn't want to tell them what you were getting. But I think this side, both sides are outspoken. And I think even the no side are more outspoken than the yes side. I don't think there's a secret voter in this. Like, I've seen cars with the vote no, I've seen cars with the repeal, I've seen people with vote no badges, I've seen people with vote yes. Like, everybody is vocal, everybody is talking about it. And okay, maybe there might be a minor effect if there's one person among a group of 10, but I think the majority of no voters are in a very...
They're in plain sight.
Yeah, and they're in their own macrocosm or microcosm of no voters. Well, same with yes voters, they're in their own microcosm of yes voters. And so, while maybe it might appear that there's a secret voter within or effect in your group, I don't think it is evident across all of Ireland. And I think that everybody is quite vocal, everybody is willing to say who they are, and then statistically, I'm praying statistically that the polls stay up. Not like everything else aside, the reason I'm praying is because stats are so important, statistics are so important, and if they're wrong again, it really undermines polls completely. And look, you very could be right, but I just think that this one is more black and white in the sense that people are willing to portray what they believe in.
I suppose, just to clarify my argument there, I wasn't necessarily saying that no are more likely to win
Yeah.
based on that. I suppose almost in a subconscious level, my motivations for saying what I said on that topic was to encourage. I'm not trying to tell you to vote in any particular way, but I suppose if you are planning on voting yes, and you do fundamentally believe in what you're voting for, I suppose it's a way of motivating you to actually go out and vote on the day, because, as I said, I believe that the no vote, they're confident. They're not worried. They're not having this big... I see a lot of people trying to portray the no voters as being completely all over the place. They don't know what they're voting for. They're disorganised. We talked about the resources, Canto, we talked about the money they have behind their election. You can say what you want about their morals, their ethics, their opinions. They're not disorganised, and they're not short of cash or short of resources. So I suppose it's a way of trying to encourage people who want to vote yes to actually vote yes, because the no aren't going to go down quietly.
Yep.
Which brings me on to another theory that I have on the election too, which is something that I wanted to talk about, and you're probably going to be bored of listening to it now because I spoke to you about it for about an hour inside before we prepared this, but it's around the whole idea of identity politics. And it's something I'm not going to even suggest I'm taking any credit for what I'm about to say. This is all...
It's probably more dangerous to take credit for something like this, to be honest with you.
Yeah, potentially, yeah. No, so this, I've become very interested in the podcast of Sam Harris, who is an American writer and scientist, and he is a fundamental believer, or not a believer as such, but he is very outspoken against the whole idea of identity politics. So the idea of identity politics is the idea of taking a particular side or a stance based on what can be portrayed or what can be perceived as an irrational or irrelevant belief that usually relates to yourself based on the opinion you're taking. So that's a very, very long-winded way of saying that. So if you look at it this way, let's say, for example, Jordan, the two of us were to sit here and try to encourage people to vote no, okay? And let's say that theoretically some kind of data or some sort of science came out that, let's say it proved theoretically that even abortion in the first 12 weeks was cruel or unethical or was harmful to a conscious being. Okay, theoretically, let's just say that. And let's say the two of us were to sit here and promote a vote no based on this scientific data. Not because of our beliefs in anything else, but just solely because of that data. And we were to raise strong arguments in favour of that and open ourselves to debate. There is not a doubt in my mind, correct me if I'm wrong, there is not a doubt in my mind that we would be attacked on all fronts because we were two men in that argument. Now that's a provocative thing for me to say. I know I might get criticism over that, but that is an idea. That is an example of identity politics. Us getting attacked over that because of our gender, even because of maybe, well, our race doesn't really come into it, but because of our gender, that we almost don't have a say in it because we as men can't get an abortion. If your argument is that you can't vote no, and this is something that I got caught up in on Twitter there a couple of weeks ago. So I started seeing a lot of people saying or implying that men who are voting no, their opinion is invalid because they're men, they can't have abortions, they'll never have to go through pregnancy. By that same logic, if you're basing that logic on the fact that they're men, then a man who's voting yes, their opinion is equally as invalid because you're basing the argument on the fact that they're men, not because of their actual argument. So identity politics, for example, why should it be the case where we can presume someone's views on one subject based on their views of another? Why should, if I was to propose this, okay, I would put my house, not that I have one, I put all my money, not that I have any, on the probability that if you're voting yes, anyone listening to this, if you're voting yes on the 8th Amendment referendum, then you more than likely voted yes to marriage equality, you're more than likely pro-EU, you're more than likely pro-immigration, and you're more than likely anti-Trump. I don't think that we should live in a society where people's views on one thing can be predicted based on their views of another. Because just based on something I haven't explained this very well. I
I
haven't
think
done,
you have. I think
I
you
haven't
explained
done
it really
I haven't
well.
done Sam Harris that much justice here, but
Like,
the-
look, I think you're going to get a lot of hate for this, whatever way you try and explain it. But I think you've made a very fair point with associating one entity with another in terms of when you're coming to vote. Like, it's a referendum about a line in a constitution, and you answer yes or no. A referendum, because the whole idea of it is that it's asking everybody in Ireland, it's in the constitution because it's something that everybody in Ireland has to decide on. And so that, look, it is a very fair point. Like, personally, maybe I don't agree with every point of it, but like, I think you've articulated it well, and I think it's a very...
I'd encourage everyone to vote this Friday. Obviously, I'm going to vote yes, as we've said, or as you clarified for everybody that I'm voting yes. So thank you for that.
Yeah. Imagine if I did it the other way. Imagine
Oh,
I threw
you
on there
could
and I was like,
really
just to
thrown
let you, just to let everybody know here, Evan's voting no. So,
You know, I think that people should make up their opinions on what they're voting based on their own rational beliefs of it, not because of the beliefs of your friends. Not because you go to UCD and all your friends wear repeal jumpers. That's not a reason why you have to vote yes. Even if you want to take identity politics to an extreme, let's say, for example, your sister, your mother, your daughter had to have an abortion last year. In terms of identity politics, that shouldn't have an effect on your decision. It will. There's no doubt that for most people it would. And I haven't been in that position, touch wood, so I can't say for definite it wouldn't affect me. But I think that
for the sake of this theory.
For the sake of this theory, and to summarise it, if you want to make a change in the world, or you want to make a change in society, you have to make the change in the society that you can picture yourself not being in. You have to separate yourself from that situation and then make the change. That's the only way you can get rational thought on a decision. And again, Jason O'Mahony, I think it is, he wrote a brilliant article there in the Times this week, and he said, repeal or not, let us be kind to each other. And he basically makes the point that, you know, we're moving into a society where we're almost trying to find divisions between each other rather than actually work together. And he finishes the article off, and, you know, he says from the outset that he's voting yes, and he wants other people to vote yes. But he says that whatever happens on Saturday, let's be a little gentle with each other in the aftermath. For months now, thousands of ordinary people have been putting up posters, handing out leaflets and knocking on doors. There are plenty of countries where you would risk your safety for doing the same. This has been a pretty unpleasant process at times, but it has also been the mark of a rigorous democracy. Campaigners on both sides can take equal pride in playing their role in that. And I think that's what's most important, is that we, regardless of the result of this referendum, that we have to keep working together as a unified society. I mean, look, just to go back, I know I'm going on a complete rant here, a complete tangent. Just to go back to what you were saying about Northern Ireland, you know, that's an extreme case, but that was because of two fundamental different beliefs who wouldn't listen to each other and they wouldn't respect each other, and that's what happened. So I'll leave that with you because I went on an awful rant there that I wasn't planning to go on.
I think it was well said. I think, like, look, there's definitely parts where I differ from identity politics, but I think you argued its case well, and the points you were portraying were really, really nice. That whole working together idea is so important, and it's something that can be missed at times. So keep it up, everybody. We've done it for 100 years now. Well, actually, in terms of the Irish Free State, a little bit less, but keep going.
We've tried our best, at least.
We've done our best.
I think that...
Yeah, like, look, we were going to finish up with just a bit of the legislation and fact-checking, but I think it kind of almost goes a little bit takes away from the argument we're making. I don't know.
Well, what do you have? Tell us what you have.
Like, look, basically I want to talk a little bit about the legislation. I think it's something that people really need to look at because, on either side, just educate yourself on and know what you're voting for, that this is going to be the legislation. Now, the difference between legislation and constitutional acts is that the constitution needs a referendum, the legislation won't. So this legislation that comes in can be changed by politics. So realise that when you're repealing this, there's going to be legislation that replaces it. It's going to be easier to change, and it's going to be changeable by politicians rather than having to go to referendum for every time. So even if you aren't happy with it, you can work with your local politicians to have these changed in future bills and whatnot. So that's the first thing. Like, the legislation does allow abortion up to 12 weeks. After that, you'll need the approval of 2 medical practitioners. But anyway, there's a series of checks you'll need. Suicide is not necessarily included in all of them. That's up to 6 months. So look, there's a lot of posters, a lot of ads from both sides that are going up. It's really, really important that they're fact checked, that you know what's going on, that you know the full facts. Like, one of the interesting ones we saw is that 1 in 5 pregnancies are aborted in the UK, and if you look at the figures straight away, that looks true, but it doesn't take into account miscarriages, it doesn't account for people coming across from Ireland. So there's a lot of different things like that. Like, I'm sure there's plenty on the Yes campaign.
Yeah, I mean, there's one of the biggest ones, I suppose, that was fact checked. Just as well to give credit to the Irish Times for these fact checks.
Yeah,
well.
again, I've stolen so much of my. I'm all for like using.
We're
so
making
many
ourselves
different
look like
sources.
these great investigative journalists. That
Isn't
we're
it
really
great
not.
that they just started advertising on us then during the week?
It's
Isn't it
brilliant.
our first monitoring?
Yeah, so the most prominent Yes poster that has been under question is the Solidarity. I can't remember the full name of the group. Solidarity Party. Is it just that?
Solidarity Alliance.
Solidarity Alliance. So they have their poster. It says that 170,000 plus women have had to travel for abortions, and that, you know, once you start bringing numbers into any sort of campaign material, you're already playing with fire there. Now, as the Irish Times pointed out, according to their data and their analytics, that is in fact true. I think it's 170,000, and then there's a couple of hundred in there, so there's rounded off at 170,000. But you can rest assured that's a true statistic, and there's not really much differentiation there. It's a pretty hardcore statistic, like.
Yeah, good job, guys. Fact checked fact.
Well done, Irish Times. I think that pretty much winds us up, doesn't it?
Yeah, sorry for such a long. Well, no.
not
You're
sorry.
welcome for such a long.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I feel like sometimes we got a lot of hassle the first time we did a 1.5 hour long podcast. This is a little bit shorter.
Hey, look, we've 5 weeks
That's
of material.
content, guys.
Yeah, we've 5 weeks of material here.
Yeah.
So yeah, look,
This is all you're going to get for another 5 weeks now.
Yeah.
So you break that up over 5 weeks. That's like 20 minutes.
we only do 10 a year, guys. It's very valuable.
Our weekly podcast that's done every 6 weeks.
Yeah, I mean that's unique. I don't know any other weekly podcast.
It's our niche. We found another one.
A dark web podcast. We sell
a
guns.
dark web weekly podcast.
Dark web weekly podcast. They only actually release a podcast every 5 to 6 weeks, and we shill guns on it.
And are advertised by the Irish Times.
Irish Times and the Times. So yeah, thanks to the Irish Times for letting us steal your information. The Times of Ireland as well. Jason O'Mahony got in there. Good
Just to
man.
be clear, we don't just use these. We do actually do research on plenty of other websites. It just so happened that our
Red
quotes
Sea,
were
the Red
today.
Sea boys.
Yeah.
Irish Examiner. They always have some good stuff.
Yeah.
The Journal. They even got a look in there this
The
week.
Star,
as well.
the Sun.
Even the Liberal for all our fake news that we needed for the week. So yeah, look, we've looked at the smear test scandal in Ireland. We've looked at the Northern Ireland border. We've looked at the 8th Amendment referendum, and we have looked at the GDPR and how Helen Dixon might be bringing down the barriers on Mark Zuckerberg. Jordan, until next time.
It's been an exciting one.
It's been a pleasure.